Elliot Graves was 44 years old, and until the Tuesday evening his wife slid divorce papers across the kitchen table, he believed he was in a marriage. Claudette had it all mapped out. The house, the bank accounts, the buyout of the business he built from nothing. She'd even done him the favor of waiving any claim to what she called his junk collection. 12 years of garage clutter, she told her attorney. Not worth appraising. Elliot watched her sign the paperwork with the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. What she didn't know, what she had never once bothered to find out, was that the garage she'd spent 12 years dismissing housed a meticulously curated collection appraised at $7.5 million. She handed it to him with a sympathetic smile, and Elliot accepted it without a word. Because Elliot Graves was the kind of man who never showed his hand before the moment was exactly right. And that moment was coming. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The early morning light filtered through the garage's single window, casting long shadows across shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. Elliot Graves moved with deliberate steps through the narrow aisles he'd created between his carefully organized collection. The smell of cedar and archival paper filled the air, a scent that always brought him back to Saturday mornings with his father at the Shreveport junkyard. His fingers traced the spine of a leather-bound notebook, well worn but meticulously maintained. Opening it, he began his weekly inventory ritual. First, the sealed first edition Amazing Fantasy Thumper 15 in its protective case. He'd found it at the bottom of a box lot at an estate sale, buried under water-damaged romance novels. The elderly widow selling her late husband's books had just wanted them gone. "You sure you want all this junk?" she'd asked back then. Elliot smiled at the memory as he made a small notation about the comic's condition. His father Robert's voice echoed in his mind. "The whole world is full of people who can't see past the surface. That's not their fault, son. That's your advantage." Moving to the next shelf, he unwrapped a pair of Ernie Barnes sketches from their archival cloth. $60 at a grieving widow's estate sale. She'd thought they were just some old drawings. He documented their condition with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. A vintage Rolex Daytona gleamed under the fluorescent light as he examined it. He'd spotted it in a box of costume jewelry at a bankruptcy auction, mixed in with plastic beads and broken chains. The auctioneer hadn't looked twice at it. Elliot had. The signed first edition of Toni Morrison's Beloved sat in its own protective case. Church rummage sale, $2, buried under a stack of romance paperbacks. He'd recognized it immediately, but his face hadn't changed. His father had taught him that too. Never let them see what you've found until you've already bought it. The sound of expensive heels on concrete interrupted his inventory. Claudette appeared in the doorway, silk robe tied loosely, coffee mug in hand. Coffee she'd made only for herself, as usual. She leaned against the frame, not quite entering what she considered his space of clutter. "My sister's coming next weekend," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of controlled irritation. "This garage situation really needs to be dealt with, Elliot." He looked up from his notebook, taking in the details. Her new perfume, the third change in 2 months, her phone clutched in her other hand, angled away, always away lately. The way she didn't quite meet his eyes. "The garage is organized," he said quietly. "Organized chaos is still chaos." She sipped her coffee, surveying the shelves with thinly veiled contempt. "We've talked about this." "No," he thought. "We haven't talked. You've declared and I've listened." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and something in her expression shifted. Subtle, but Elliot caught it. He caught everything. "Just think about it," she said, already turning away, already checking her message. She didn't wait for his response. The door settled shut behind her, with a soft click. Elliot stood motionless for a moment, letting the familiar quiet of his sanctuary settle back around him. He could hear her heels on the kitchen tile above, moving away. Returning to his notebook, he continued his inventory with the same methodical care. Each item documented, each condition noted, each acquisition story remembered. The household's pressure weighed on him. Months of silent dinners, of phones turned face down, of conversations that never quite happened. He reached for a fresh page in his notebook. At the top, in his precise handwriting, he wrote a single word: watching. Then he returned to his inventory, moving through his collection with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the most valuable things often hide in plain sight. His father's lessons wrapped around him like a familiar coat. Observe everything, react to nothing, wait for the right moment. The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across his shelves of treasures, treasures that only he could see. The kitchen light cast a harsh fluorescent glow over the polished wood table where Claudette sat, her posture perfect, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Elliot noticed these details as he stepped through the door, still in his work clothes, the smell of machine oil and metal clinging to him despite his end-of-day cleanup. She'd been waiting. The scene felt staged, the empty chair across from her, the papers lying face down beside her cup, the careful way she'd positioned herself under the light. Even her outfit seemed chosen for the moment, the cream-colored blouse she wore to important meetings, pearl earrings catching the light. "Sit down, Elliot," she said, her voice controlled. "We need to talk." He took in the room with the same quiet attention he brought to everything: the papers, her rigid posture, the way her fingers tightened around the cup. Moving with unhurried steps, he pulled out the chair and sat. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Claudette began, her words carrying the smooth polish of rehearsal. "About us, about where we are and where we're going." She paused, watching him with careful eyes. "I think we both know things haven't been right for a while." Elliot sat still, letting the silence fill the space between them. The hum of the refrigerator seemed unusually loud. "We've grown in different directions," she continued, her voice taking on a practiced gentleness. "We want different things. I think—" She straightened the papers without turning them over. "I think we both deserve more than what this has become." She spoke about reflection, about mutual respect, about making clean breaks while they could still be civil. Each word came out measured, reasonable, wrapped in the language of self-help books and therapy sessions, but her eyes kept drifting to her phone, face down beside the coffee cup. Finally, she turned the papers over. Divorce papers, already drawn up. Sticky tabs marking signature lines. "My attorney has worked everything out," she said, sliding them across the table. "I think you'll find it's very fair. The house and joint accounts will transfer to me, and there's a reasonable buyout figure for your share of the business." Elliot picked up the papers, reading slowly. "Their HVAC company, incorporated 8 years ago when things were good, when Claudette still asked about his day, and meant it. The house they'd chosen together, back when together meant something different." His eyes moved down the itemized list until he reached a line near the bottom. "Personal effects, collection, waived." "Keep the collection, Elliot," Claudette said, and there was something almost like generosity in her voice. "Lord knows you love it more than anything else in this house." The words were meant to sting, but they landed differently than she intended. 12 years, and she'd never once asked what was in those carefully wrapped packages, never wondered why he kept such detailed records, never questioned why Victor Asante, one of the city's most respected appraisers, stopped by for coffee every few months. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft tap of Claudette's fingernail against her coffee cup. "Is there someone else?" Elliot asked quietly, looking up from the papers to meet her eyes. She held his gaze steadily. "No, I just Think we're done." He studied her face, the same way he studied potential acquisitions, looking for the tells that separated authentic from counterfeit. She'd always thought his patience was passivity. She'd never understood that patience was how he'd built everything valuable in his life. "I'll have my attorney look at these," he said, his voice calm and measured. He gathered the papers without hurry, folded them precisely, and stood up. Claudette watched him, something flickering across her face. Disappointment, maybe, at his lack of reaction. "That's it? For now," he said simply, and walked out of the kitchen. Later that night, alone in the garage, Elliot sat in his father's old armchair. He allowed himself 1 hour, no more, no less, to feel the full weight of what was ending. Real grief, private and honest, for the marriage he'd believed in, and the woman he'd thought he knew. When the hour was up, he dried his eyes, straightened his shoulders, and reached for his inventory notebook. With the same precise handwriting he'd used to document every acquisition, every discovery, every hidden treasure others had overlooked, he opened to a fresh page and began to write. The garage was quiet, except for the scratch of his pen against paper. Above him, he could hear Claudette's footsteps moving through their bedroom, soon to be her bedroom. She was probably already redecorating it in her mind. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows, casting long shadows across shelves lined with carefully wrapped treasures. Elliot sat at his workbench, phone in hand, making 2 calls that would set everything in motion. "Phyllis Drummond's office," a crisp voice answered. "This is Elliot Graves. I need to schedule a consultation with Phyllis." His voice was steady, measured. The secretary offered a time later that afternoon. Elliot accepted without hesitation. His second call went to Victor Asante. Victor answered on the second ring, his deep voice familiar and professional. "Elliot, it's been a few months. I need a full collection appraisal, Victor. Everything." A pause. "Everything?" "Yes. Can you start today?" Victor arrived at noon, dressed in his usual pressed slacks and button-down shirt, carrying his leather appraisal kit. He'd been through this garage dozens of times over 15 years, but never like this, never all at once. They started with the comics. The sealed first edition Amazing Fantasy Round 15 drew Victor's first reaction, a slight raise of his eyebrows. He made careful notes, measuring light exposure, examining the seal. Next came the art, the Ernie Barnes sketches, still in their original frames from the widow's estate sale. Victor's pen moved steadily across his notepad. Hour after hour, they moved through the collection. The vintage Rolex Daytona gleamed under Victor's loupe as he verified its authenticity. The signed Toni Morrison, Beloved, perfectly preserved, its provenance documented in Elliot's meticulous records. Each piece had a story. Each story was written in Elliot's leather notebook, dates and details preserved with a collector's precision. The second day brought them to the rare vinyl record, the vintage baseball cards, the early black cinema posters. Victor maintained his professional composure, but his silence grew heavier with each revelation. He understood now why Elliot had called for everything at once. A week later, Victor hand-delivered a sealed envelope to Elliot's garage. The document inside bore Victor's letterhead and official seal, its pages filled with detailed descriptions and valuations. On the final page, a single number stood out: $7,500,000, conservative floor. Elliot read it twice, then called Phyllis. Her office was cool and organized, like her mind. She reviewed the divorce papers, the waiver, and Victor's appraisal with methodical attention. Her attorney signed off on this without performing a valuation, she said, looking at Elliot over her reading glasses. That is their problem, not yours. The waiver is binding. Elliot nodded. I'd like to retain you formally. Of course. She pulled out a contract, already prepared. That evening, Elliot met his cousin Adrian at their usual diner. She listened without interruption as he explained exactly what he needed: emotional support, discretion, and her steady presence. Nothing more, nothing less. "You know I'm here," she said simply, covering his hand with hers for a moment. She didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. Burl Okafor met him for breakfast the next morning. The retired insurance adjuster had known Elliot for 20 years, had seen him build the collection piece by piece. Elliot laid out what he needed: background information, discreet inquiries, professional thoroughness. "Just tell me what you're looking for," Burl said, his notebook already open. Through it all, Elliot maintained absolute normalcy at home. He went to work, came home, spent time in the garage. Claudette moved through the house like a ghost, their interactions limited to necessary courtesies. She seemed relieved by his apparent acceptance, never questioning why he spent more time than usual in the garage. She didn't notice the visits from Victor. She didn't ask about his meetings with Phyllis. She had always seen what she expected to see: a simple man with a worthless hobby, accepting his fate with the same quiet passivity she'd always attributed to him. After everyone had gone, after all the pieces were in place, Elliot sat in his father's armchair in the garage. Victor's appraisal document lay closed in his notebook, its implications enormous, yet somehow weightless. He wasn't celebrating. He was thinking. The room around him held millions in carefully curated treasures, each piece selected with his father's wisdom echoing in his mind. "The whole world is full of people who can't see past the surface. That's not their fault, son. That's your advantage." The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Through the window he could see Claudette's car in the driveway, her silhouette moving past the kitchen window. She had never once asked what any of it was worth, had never wondered why he kept such careful records, had never looked past the surface of anything in this room. Or, he now understood, anything in their marriage. He sat in the quiet, surrounded by the values she had so casually signed away, and thought about patience, about time, about the difference between what people show and what they keep hidden. The kitchen had become a carefully orchestrated dance of avoidance. Elliot stood at the counter, making his coffee as Claudette finished her breakfast at the table. Neither spoke. The morning light caught the edge of her wedding ring. Still there, though it meant something different now. He poured his coffee into a travel mug, nodding slightly as he passed her on his way to the garage. This was their new normal: measured politeness, careful distance, scheduled use of shared spaces. Sitting at his workbench, Elliot opened his notebook. Not the inventory one, a new one, where he'd begun tracking patterns. 8 months ago, things had shifted. The change was subtle at first, like watching shadows lengthen across a wall. Claudette had announced her interest in real estate almost casually over dinner. "I'm joining a women's networking group," she'd said, scrolling through her phone. "Professional development. It meets on Thursdays." He remembered nodding, asking if she wanted him to save dinner for her. She'd smiled, that new smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said not to bother. The Thursday meetings stretched longer each week. She'd come home carrying the scent of wine and professional ambition, talking about market trends and development opportunities. Her phone became a constant companion, angled away from his line of sight. Elliot wrote down dates, times, small details that had seemed insignificant then, but formed a clear pattern now. The networking group, the late Thursday returns, the way she stopped sharing the details of her day. Then there was the voicemail. 3 weeks ago, her phone had chimed during dinner. She'd let it go to voicemail, but the speaker was on. A male voice, smooth and confident. "Claudette, it's Darius Webb. About the development opportunity we discussed." She'd silenced it quickly, too quickly, her composure slipping for just a moment. Elliot had filed the name away, noting how she'd changed the subject without acknowledging the call. Later that week, he met Burl for lunch at their usual diner. The retired insurance adjuster was already settled in their regular booth, coffee cooling beside his crossword puzzle. "How are you holding up?" Burl asked, setting the puzzle aside. Elliot stirred his coffee methodically. "Managing. Actually, I could use your expertise on something. He kept his tone casual, just another conversation between old friends. Ever run across anyone named Darius Webb in your work? Burl's expression didn't change, but his pen stopped moving. Can't say that I have. Should I? Just curious. Tall guy, maybe 6'2". Well-dressed. Real estate development, I think. Elliot delivered the details as if they were afterthoughts, not the result of careful observation and memory. Meanwhile, Phyllis had been building the legal framework around the business valuation. She'd called yesterday with an update. "The contract you secured with Riverside Commercial Properties," she'd said. "That was entirely your relationship, correct? Claudette had no involvement?" "That's right. Built that connection through my maintenance work at their other properties. Signed it myself." "Good. That contract represents the majority of the business's growth over the last 4 years. I can make a strong case that the appreciated value belongs primarily to you." Elliot added this to his notebook, another piece moving into place. At home, the careful dance continued. Claudette cooked elaborate meals for one, leaving the kitchen spotless. Elliot ate sandwiches in the garage, surrounded by his collection. Their conversations were limited to logistics. "The water bill is on the counter. I'll be late tomorrow. The garbage needs to go out." Each interaction felt like a performance, both of them playing roles in a production neither had admitted was running. But Elliot was watching now, really watching, with the same attention to detail he'd learned from his father. 2 weeks after their lunch, Burl called. "Give me some time," he said. "I'll be in touch." That evening, Elliot pulled into his driveway. Claudette's car was there, her silhouette visible through the kitchen window. She was cooking again, probably something complicated and meant for one. He sat in his truck for a moment, hands still on the wheel. The house loomed before him, familiar and strange at once, like a photograph that's been subtly altered. Inside, his wife moved through their shared space like a stranger, carrying secrets she thought were still hidden. Outside, Elliot watched and waited, knowing that sometimes the most important part of discovery is simply paying attention. The moment stretched, filled with the weight of unspoken things. Then, following the script of their careful choreography, he reached for his door handle and prepared to enter. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly in the gray morning light as Elliot pulled into the parking lot. Burl's pickup was already there, parked in their usual spot near the back. Inside, the breakfast crowd had thinned, leaving scattered cups of cooling coffee and half-eaten plates. Burl sat in their regular booth, a manila envelope on the table beside him. He didn't look up when Elliot slid into the seat across from him, just pushed his coffee cup to the side and folded his hands. "You want the short version or the long one?" Burl asked. "All of it," Elliot said quietly. Burl opened the envelope and laid out documents one by one, like dealing cards in a game nobody wanted to play. Darius Webb, mid-level real estate developer. Works mainly in commercial properties, mixed-use developments. Good at starting projects, less good at finishing them. Charm's his main asset. Gets investors excited, then moves on when things get complicated. He slid across a printed LinkedIn profile. Professional headshot, confident smile, carefully curated work history. Elliot studied it without expression. "His circles overlap with that networking group Claudette joined," Burl continued. "He's a regular speaker at their events, talks about market opportunities, development strategies." He paused. "Thursday evening sessions." The next document was a social media photo. A rooftop event, string lights, well-dressed people holding wine glasses. Burl pointed to the background. There was Claudette, caught in profile, looking up at someone just out of frame. She was laughing, her head thrown back slightly, one hand resting on a tall man's arm. Elliot knew that laugh. He remembered it from their early days, before the garage became a point of contention, before her mother's influence had hardened into judgment. 7 months ago, Burl said quietly. The Skyline development mixer. More documents followed. Credit card receipts showing dinner charges at upscale restaurants. A weekend booking at a boutique hotel 2 hours away, registered under C. Graves. Parking records showing Darius's BMW in the structure beside the networking group's building. Thursday evenings, regular as clockwork. Got this from a former colleague who handles corporate security. Earl explained. He keeps tabs on certain buildings' parking systems. Said this pattern jumped out at him. The last document was a screenshot of a text message thread. Burl hesitated before sliding it across. Contact of mine got this. Won't say how, but it's authenticated. Elliot read it slowly. Darius's number at the top, messaging someone whose name was redacted. Dinner with C again tonight. She's ready to move on this. Just needs to finish wrapping up the situation with her husband. Guy named Elliot. HVC business. Collector of some kind. She says he won't make waves. The timestamp was from 3 months ago. Elliot sat very still, letting the weight of it settle. The careful distance, the angled phone, the networking group that met like clockwork. All of it assembled into a picture he'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. And here was Darius Webb. Not some unwitting third party, but a man who knew exactly what he was participating in. There's more background, if you want it, Burl offered. Business history, project details, personal connections. But that's the core of it. Elliot gathered the documents carefully, sliding them back into chronological order. Each one went into the envelope with deliberate precision. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. To anyone watching, he might have been reviewing routine paperwork. "Thank you," he said simply. "You okay?" Burl's voice carried decades of friendship and concern. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Elliot replied. He stood, tucking the envelope into his jacket. "I appreciate the work you did on this." The drive to Phyllis's office took 20 minutes. Traffic moved around him like water around a stone. He parked, rode the elevator to her floor, and walked past the reception desk with a nod. Her door was open. Phyllis looked up from her computer as he entered. Without a word, he placed Burl's envelope on her desk. She opened it, reading each document with the same methodical attention he had shown at the diner. When she finished, she looked at him over her reading glasses and nodded once. "This," she said, "changes the math considerably." The conference room at Phyllis's law office felt different in the morning light. Elliot sat across from her desk, watching as she arranged documents with surgical precision. The affair evidence, the business valuation reports, and the original settlement proposal Claudette's attorney had submitted. "Let me be very clear about our position," Phyllis began, tapping the stack with one manicured finger. "Our state recognizes fault-based divorce adjustment. Documented infidelity isn't just about moral judgment. It materially affects asset division calculation." She pulled out a highlighted statute document. "More importantly, the timing of these Thursday meetings coincides directly with the period when your HVAC business secured its largest contract, a contract you negotiated independently through relationships you built before the marriage." Elliot nodded slowly. "The Hamilton Development Project." "Exactly. That contract represents nearly 60% of the business's current value. Claudette's attorney structured their buyout demand, assuming equal contribution during the marriage. But, with this timeline," Phyllis spread out the parking records Burl had obtained, "she was actively undermining the marriage, while you were building its most valuable asset." The intercom buzzed. Phyllis's assistant announced Adrienne was here to see Elliot. Phyllis nodded, and Adrienne entered, her hospital scrubs still on from her morning shift. "I just came from Gloria's," she said without preamble. Her face carried something that made Elliot sit straighter. "You need to hear this." She sat down heavily in the chair beside him. "I was having coffee with your mama when Sister Jenkins from church stopped by. She started talking about how sorry she was about everything, how she'd been praying for you both since she first heard things weren't right." Elliot waited, watching his cousin's hands twist together. Then she said something that didn't make sense, about how she'd been worried for months, ever since Paulette started telling people at the auxiliary meetings that Claudette was outgrowing the marriage. The room went very still. Paulette's been running a campaign, Elliot. Quiet, careful, but consistent. Telling people you were holding Claudette back, that you were comfortable with mediocrity, that Claudette deserved someone with vision. Adrian's voice was tight, with controlled anger. She's been seeding this narrative for months, at church functions, family gatherings, anywhere people would listen. Phyllis made a small sound of professional recognition, social groundwork, creating community sympathy before the divorce became public. That's not all, Adrian continued. Sister Jenkins said something about Paulette mentioning that nice developer man who'd been mentoring Claudette in her real estate pursuits. Her eyes met Elliot's. She knew, cousin. She knew about Darius, and she didn't just stay quiet. She helped make it look reasonable, like something Claudette deserved. Elliot absorbed this without visible reaction, but his fingers pressed slightly harder against the arm of his chair. The betrayal had roots deeper than he'd imagined. Not just Claudette's choice, not just Darius's willing participation, but Paulette's careful cultivation of the ground it grew in. He reached for his phone. "Who are you calling?" Adrian asked. "Reverend Tatum." The phone rang twice before Tatum's warm bass voice answered. "Elliot, I've been meaning to reach out. Reverend, I need to ask something of you." Elliot's voice was steady. "After the mediation next week, would you be willing to host a family gathering at your house?" There was a brief pause. "You don't need to explain why," Tatum said finally. "My home is open to you. Just tell me who needs to be there." "Thank you," Elliot said simply, and ended the call. He looked at Phyllis. "The mediation is Thursday?" She nodded. 10 a.m. "Good." He pulled out his notebook, the same one that held Victor's appraisal, Burrell's evidence, everything that mattered. On a fresh page, he began writing names: Gloria Graves, Adrienne Taylor, Greta Fontaine, Claudette's aunt, the honest one, Sister Jenkins, Reverend Tatum, Aunt Marie, Aunt Patricia. He wrote each name with the same careful attention he gave to cataloging his collection. These were the witnesses who needed to be present when the truth was spoken aloud, when Paulette's carefully constructed narrative met the reality it had tried to hide. "Are you sure about this?" Adrienne asked softly. Elliot looked up from the list. "Some things need to be said in the right room," he answered, "with the right people present to hear them." The house settled into evening shadows as Claudette moved through the kitchen, humming softly to herself. She packed away the dinner she'd made just for one, wiping the counter with practiced efficiency. Tomorrow was Thursday, mediation day, the end of what she had come to think of as the transition period. Her phone buzzed with a text from her attorney confirming the time, 10 a.m. sharp. In the garage, Elliot sat in his father's old armchair, surrounded by the collection that Claudette had dismissed for 12 years. The Ernie Barnes sketches caught the last light through the window. The sealed Amazing Fantasy Lover 15 rested in its protective case. The vintage Rolex Daytona ticked steadily in its display box. Each piece carried a story, not just of its acquisition, but of the patience it took to recognize value others missed. He didn't reach for Phyllis's documents or Burrell's evidence. Those were ready. Tonight wasn't about preparation. Tonight was about something he'd been avoiding. Honest reckoning. The leather notebook lay open in his lap, its pages blank. He began to write, not an inventory this time, but a letter he knew he would never send. "Claudette, I loved you. That's the first truth, and it matters that I say it. I loved you through quiet Sunday mornings and long Thursday nights, through the years when the garage was just starting to fill, when you still sometimes came to the door and asked what I'd found. I loved you, even as I watched you stop asking. I was not a perfect husband. I lived too much in my head sometimes, spent too many evenings cataloging treasures instead of building bridges. When you joined the networking group, I told myself it was good that you were finding your path. When you started coming home later, wearing a perfume you never mentioned, angling your phone away at dinner, I chose not to look directly at what was changing. That's on me. Not what you did, but that I saw it coming and looked away. You thought I didn't see you. The truth is, I saw everything. I just didn't want to name it. Because naming it meant facing what we'd become. Two people living in different stories about the same marriage. Your mother helped you write your version. She told people I was holding you back, that you deserved more vision, more ambition, more than what I had built. She never understood that building takes patience. That real value isn't always visible from the outside. Tomorrow, you'll learn what the collection is worth. But that number isn't the point. The point is that for 12 years, you lived with a man who could see value where others missed it, who built something extraordinary through patience and attention. And you never once looked closely enough to see what was right in front of you. I don't hate you. That would be easier. I see you clearly now. Your ambitions, your mother's influence, your need for a life that looks different than what we built. I understand why Darius's version of success felt like an escape route. But understanding isn't forgiveness. What you did, the lies, the Thursday meetings, the careful construction of a narrative where I was the obstacle to your growth, that wasn't about growing apart. That was about choosing to destroy something instead of having the courage to face it honestly. Tomorrow isn't about revenge. It's about correction, about truth finally being spoken in rooms where lies have lived too long. Elliot. He read it once, slowly. Then he walked to the kitchen sink, struck a match, and watched the pages curl and blacken. He didn't need to send it. He needed to say it. His phone rang. Adrian's name lit up the screen. You okay? Her voice carried all the worry she'd been holding. Elliot watched the last of the letter turn to ash. I'm past okay, he said quietly. I'm ready. He slept in the armchair, surrounded by the collection that represented not just value, but vindication. In the morning, he showered and dressed with deliberate care. The suit he pulled from its garment bag still carried the tag from the department store where he'd bought it for a job interview 12 years ago. He'd never needed it since. His work clothes were comfortable, practical things. The suit fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Through the garage window, he could see Claudette's car already gone. She'd left early, probably to meet her attorney for pre-mediation preparation. She still thought today was a formality, the final step in a clean exit from a life she'd outgrown. Elliot locked the garage door, each turn of the key deliberate and final. He got into his truck, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. The morning light caught his wedding ring. He'd kept wearing it during the separation, not from hope, but from habit. Today would be its last day. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, heading toward the mediation office. The mediation room on the 4th floor felt smaller than its actual dimensions, compressed by fluorescent lighting and institutional beige walls. A long table dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting the overhead glare. 2 water pitchers sat untouched, drops of condensation sliding down their sides. Elliot and Phyllis had arrived 15 minutes early, choosing seats that faced the door. Phyllis arranged her documents with practiced precision, each folder aligned perfectly, her legal pad positioned at exactly the right angle for quick notes. Elliot sat still, his father's teaching echoing in his mind. Patience isn't weakness. It's the foundation everything else stands on. When Claudette entered with her attorney, James Morrison, her composure was studied. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, the kind of confidence that came from believing you knew exactly how a story would end. She barely glanced at Elliot as she took her seat, arranging herself like someone preparing for a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering negotiation. Morrison opened his briefcase with flourish, extracting documents with the casual authority of a man who had done this hundreds of times. "Let's begin with the agreed framework," he said, his voice carrying the rehearsed warmth of professional courtesy. "The marital residence transfers to Mrs. Graves, with Mr. Graves relinquishing all claim to equity. Joint accounts will be divided 60-40, reflecting Mrs. Graves's greater contribution during the marriage's final years." He shuffled papers, finding the business valuation section. "Regarding the HVAC enterprise, our calculation of Mr. Graves's buyout obligation comes to—" Phyllis's hand moved with deliberate grace, sliding Victor's notarized appraisal across the table's polished surface. The document's crisp letterhead caught the fluorescent light. Morrison's words stopped mid-sentence. His hand reached for the appraisal with professional automaticity, but his eyes registered the first flicker of uncertainty. He read. He set the document down. His fingers drummed once on the table edge, a tell he probably didn't know he had. He picked up the appraisal again. Claudette watched this sequence with growing tension. "James?" Her voice carried an edge she couldn't quite hide. "What is it?" Morrison leaned close to his client, speaking in what he probably thought was a whisper, but carried in the room's dead air. "The collection, the personal property you waived, it's been professionally appraised at $7.5 million. Claudette went absolutely still. Her face moved through expressions like someone flipping through channels. Disbelief first, then rapid calculation, then genuine shock as the full weight of what she had signed away settled into place. She looked at Elliot for the first time since entering the room. Phyllis spoke into the silence, her voice carrying the precise neutrality of someone who had already won. "My client's wife executed a written waiver of any claim to the personal property collection. The waiver, signed by your office without independent appraisal, is legally binding." She paused, letting that settle. "We are here today to ensure the remaining asset division is recalibrated accordingly, specifically the business valuation and the fault-based adjustment triggered by the documentation I'll now provide." The affair evidence landed on the table with quiet finality. Text messages, photos, travel records, Earl's work. Methodically assembled and legally unassailable. Morrison's professional mask slipped entirely as he read. His pen tapped against his legal pad. Another tell. He leaned to whisper to Claudette again, but she was no longer looking at him. She was looking at Elliot. Elliot met her gaze once, holding it without anger or triumph. He looked at her with something worse, complete recognition. The clear, settled understanding of a man who no longer needed to protect himself from what he saw. All her calculations, her careful framing, her managed appearances, they lay exposed under that gaze like specimens under glass. The next hour passed in legal terminology and amended figures. The business buyout claim evaporated entirely. The joint account division shifted dramatically. Morrison attempted several procedural objections, each one dying under Phyllis's precise citations of state law regarding fault-based divorce proceedings. Claudette signed the revised agreement mechanically, her pen moving across signature lines like something automated. Her carefully constructed exit strategy had collapsed in on itself, leaving her with the house she'd wanted, but none of the financial foundation she'd counted on to support her next chapter. Elliot signed last, his signature as measured and controlled as everything else about him. He had not spoken a single word throughout the proceedings. He didn't need to. The documents spoke for him. Phyllis gathered their materials with the same precision she'd shown in arranging them. She and Elliot stood together, leaving Morrison still shuffling papers, and Claudette sitting very straight, staring at nothing. In the parking lot, summer heat rippling off asphalt, Phyllis turned to him. "It's done." Elliot nodded once. He got into his truck and drove home. Reverend Tatum's dining room glowed with late afternoon light, the polished mahogany table set for 6 with his best china. Elliot arrived early, helping arrange water glasses and silverware with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood filled the air. Sarah made her sweet potato pie, Reverend Tatum said, placing the dessert on the sideboard. She remembered it's your mother's favorite. Elliot nodded, adjusting a fork to perfect alignment. Please thank her for me. They worked in companionable silence until the doorbell rang. Gloria arrived first, wearing her good blue dress and carrying herself with the dignity that had shaped Elliot's own bearing. His aunts Patricia and Marie followed, their hushed voices filling the entryway. Adrienne came next, giving Elliot a quick, fierce hug that asked no questions and demanded no response. Greta Fontaine arrived last, her silver hair swept back severely, her posture carrying the same steel that had made her the only truth-teller in Claudette's family for 40 years. She met Elliot's eyes directly as she entered, offering her hand. Thank you for including me. They settled around the table, Reverend Tatum saying grace with simple eloquence. The first course passed quietly. Bowls of perfectly seasoned gumbo, crusty bread passed hand to hand. Elliot ate mechanically, tasting nothing. When the bowls were cleared, Reverend Tatum folded his hands on the table. The gesture carried weight. This was no longer dinner, but witness. Elliot spoke without preamble, his voice steady and clear. I asked you here because you deserve the truth, not the story that's been circulating. He looked at each face in turn, his words measured and precise. 8 months ago, Claudette began an affair with a real estate developer named Darius Webb. She met him through her networking group. Their relationship was deliberate and ongoing. The room held perfectly still. Elliot continued, laying out the timeline with the same careful attention he brought to his collections. Thursday evening meetings, weekend trips documented under her name, Webb's own words referring to Elliot as the situation she's wrapping up. While this was happening, he said, Paulette was telling people I had grown cold, that I was holding Claudette back, that I was comfortable with mediocrity. His voice remained level, but Gloria's hands tightened in her lap. She knew what her daughter was doing and chose to prepare the ground for it instead of speaking truth. He described the divorce papers, the collection waiver, the mediation revelation, not as accusations, but as simple facts. When he finished, silence filled the room like something physical. Greta Fontaine sat with her hands folded, her face a study in contained anger. Finally, she spoke. Paulette told me you'd gotten cold, that you'd stopped trying. She met Elliot's gaze directly. I should have called you directly. I'm sorry. Elliot accepted this with a small nod. He didn't need more. Gloria reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the gesture carrying decades of understanding, of quiet strength passed from parent to child. He turned his palm up, returning the pressure briefly. Patricia's voice carried the weight of family judgment. That girl never deserved you. Marie nodded in agreement. Adrienne, who had watched the whole thing with tears she wouldn't let fall, said simply, It's done now. Reverend Tatum rose and began serving the sweet potato pie. The conversation shifted to lighter matters. Marie's grandchildren, Patricia's garden, Adrienne's daughter's college application. But underneath ran the current of what had been revealed, what would spread through family networks within days. Paulette's carefully constructed narrative would collapse at its source. The people whose opinions she had cultivated would now know exactly what that cultivation was for. She would have no rebuttal that anyone in this circle would receive. When the plates were cleared and goodbyes said, Elliot drove his mother home through streets purple with sunset. They rode mostly in silence, the radio playing soft jazz neither of them really heard. Gloria's small house looked warm and welcoming, porch light already on against the gathering dark. Before she got out, she turned to her son. Your father would be proud. Elliot sat in the driveway, watching until she was safely inside, before pulling away into the evening. 16 months later, Elliot stood at the entrance of the Graves Cultural Center, watching morning light stream through tall windows that faced east, just like his father's old junkyard office 3 blocks away. The polished hardwood floors gleamed, reflecting display cases filled with carefully curated treasures, each one telling its own story of value hidden in plain sight. The space smelled of fresh paint and old paper, a combination that felt exactly right. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the reading room, anchored by those rare first editions he'd kept from the collection, their spines straight and proud behind protective glass. The Ernie Barnes sketches hung prominently, finally getting the audience they deserved. He'd sold 6 pieces through Victor's gallery network over the past year, each sale methodical and precisely timed. The sealed Amazing Fantasy No. 15 went first, then the vintage Rolex Daytona, followed by 4 other carefully chosen items. Victor had handled everything with his usual quiet competence, ensuring each piece found the right buyer at full market value. The proceeds had been more than enough to purchase this building, fund the renovation, and establish an operating foundation. People began arriving for the official opening. Adrienne came through the door with her daughter Maya, now 17, and heading to Howard University in the fall. Maya had been one of his first Saturday students, sitting in those folding chairs while he taught them how to really look at things, not just see them, but understand them. "This place is beautiful," Adrienne said, hugging him tight. Maya nodded in agreement, already gravitating toward the display case holding early jazz recordings and vintage concert programs. Reverend Tatum arrived in his Sunday suit, carrying himself with the same dignity that had anchored that dinner 16 months ago. He would give the blessing shortly, his words carrying the weight of community approval that mattered more than any official certification. Gloria walked in wearing her best dress, the deep purple one she saved for special occasions, and took her seat in the front row. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile carried nothing but pride. She had watched him build this, piece by piece, never rushing, never doubting. The Saturday class students filed in, 14 teenagers who had spent months learning to see what others missed. They gathered around the teaching table where Elliot had laid out new items for evaluation. A tarnished silver compact from an estate sale, sheet music with a faded signature, a small painting dark with age. "Remember what we talked about," he said quietly. "Look past what's obvious. Research before you react. Let the piece tell you its story." They leaned forward, notebooks ready, faces intent. These kids understood something valuable now. That worth isn't always visible on the surface, that patience reveals what hurry misses. The room filled steadily. Victor came, of course, nodding approval at the display cases he'd helped design. Burl arrived with his wife, carrying a wrapped housewarming gift that Elliot would open later to find a vintage cataloging system. Exactly what the reading room needed. He heard snippets of conversation about Claudette sometimes, how she still lived in their old house but struggled with the mortgage now that the business buyout hadn't materialized, how Darius Webb's development project had stalled after that key investor quietly withdrew, somehow hearing about his conduct through unofficial channels, how they hadn't been seen together since the mediation documents surfaced with his name attached. But those stories belonged to another life. This space, this light-filled room with its treasures and its students and its future. This was his real inheritance from Robert Graves. His father had taught him to see value where others saw nothing. Now he was teaching that same lesson forward. He watched Maya explain to another student how to authenticate a signature, her hands gentle on the sheet music. 2 boys huddled over the silver compact, using their phones to research the maker's mark. A girl in the corner had already identified the artist of the small painting and was carefully documenting her findings. They were learning. They were seeing. They were carrying forward what Robert Graves had started in that junkyard office 3 blocks away. Gloria caught his eye from her front row seat and smiled. That small, knowing smile that had steadied him through everything. He smiled back, feeling the rightness of this moment, this place, this continuation of his father's philosophy. The room hummed with purpose and possibility. Elliot stood at his teaching table, surrounded by eager students and carefully preserved treasures, and felt something he could name without effort. Whole. Claudette kept the house. Elliot kept everything else. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.